So last night for homework, you should have read pages 23 to 32 for This Fleeting World. And I just want to go over some of the key points just to make sure we're all on the same page. So you want to label these notes as Fleeting World pages 23 to 32. And it's really kind of important to note that even though we're going to reference some of the areas that we're going to talk about by their modern names, that at this time we have no countries. Like there's no United States, there's no India, there's no France, there's no England, even though we're going to call those places by those names just simply because they're more familiar to her. The nation state that we know of is a 19th century construction, and that's something that we'll cover a little bit later. But we're going to start from the very beginning here so we can kind of understand why parts of the world are able to develop while other parts are not. And we're going to start with the agrarian era, and this began about 10 to 11,000 years ago with the appearance of some of the first agricultural communities. I mean, this will be a big shift from the hunting and gathering that had gone on before to these agricultural communities. And you're going to see that those places that don't have agriculture, don't have good agriculture, are not going to be some of the leaders. Their development is going to be limited because of their inability to farm. But what the agrarian era basically is the era of human history where agriculture was the most important of all productive technologies and the foundation for most human societies. And you'll see that the agrarian era is going to bring some complexities that the era of the hunters and gatherers or the foragers just simply do not have. And this era is going to be very long lasting. It's not going to be a blip in world history by any means. In reality, the agricultural era or the agrarian era only really ends within the last 250 years, where we switch from being an agricultural society to eventually being an industrial society. And that's where you're really going to see a shift as well, another shift rather, in concentration, where we're going to become industrial rather than agricultural. And you'll also see that there's going to be another big shift in development, where just like with agriculture, there's some areas that are going to have farming and some areas that can't. There's also going to be some areas that have industry and other areas that don't, or at least don't until somebody shows up to do what they need to. This era lasts about 10,000 years. So, again, like I said before, it really is not a blip with human history. And in fact, more than 70% of all humanity may have lived during this era. So that means that since man has walked the earth until now, 70% of all of the people that have ever existed on the globe lived during this 10,000 period agrarian era. Um, During this era, there's greater population density. That means that there's more people packed in smaller spaces more often and in greater numbers than we have definitely during the era of the foragers, the hunters and gatherers, but also during the modern era as well, because you're going to kind of see that some of the agrarian communities are kind of few and far between. So they tend to have a lot of people in a really, really small area. Even though all of this is great, we still have some really incredible limits in communication that ensure that some parts of the world are going to remain separate. And you're going to see that this is going to be caused by geography and complicated by geography. But it's also going to be one of those things that is going to limit the development of some areas, that they just simply don't have access to the knowledge. And once that knowledge is brought to them, because we get over these communication issues, you'll see that some of this technology, whether it's agrarian technology or later on industrial technology, is going to ultimately be brought to them, usually by invaders, and that's never necessarily a good thing. There are several world zones with large regions that have no significant contact with each other before 1500. And what we're kind of really looking at is really the end of the 15th century. So a lot of these parts of the world don't have any contact with each other until 1492, when Columbus, of course, goes out and sails the ocean blue. The four most important are the Afro-Eurasian landmass, the Americas, Australia, and also the islands of the Pacific. So what I'd like you to do right now is go dig out your map, and we're going to label it. I know it seems a little overly simplistic because some of these places are pretty self-explanatory and you should be familiar with them, but I just want to make sure that everybody is on the right page. So press pause, get your map, and then once you get your map, come back out. Okay, so what I'm going to start with is actually the Afro-Eurasian landmass. Now, I'm going to have you do something a little strange here, but I'll explain it later, and it'll become a little bit more clear why I'm doing this later on. So what I want you to do is find Africa, and I want you to draw a line right about there, give or take a little bit. And we're going to include this northern portion here, this northern portion of Africa, as part of the Afro-Eurasian landmass, but not this southern portion. And the reason why we're not going to include this southern portion is because within the northern portion, there is a substantial physical barrier. And this is going to be the Sahara Desert. So just go ahead and just label that right in, just for future reference. And then what I want you to do is basically go and extend that line just all the way over to the edge and just go ahead and pick up Korea. And then just label that this is the Afro-Eurasian landmass. And I apologize for my handwriting. And of course, the next one is the Americas, and we need to include both of them. So why don't you just go ahead and just kind of, do a little bracket off of the West Coast and then just label that the Americas. And then the last one, of course, is Australia. And unfortunately, Australia is too small for at least me to fit it all in to label the continent. So I'm going to abbreviate. If you write smaller, you want to bracket it, that's fine. You can write the whole thing. It's not necessary if you can't. Now, the last one, the islands of the Pacific, is a little bit difficult because they don't show up on your map really, really well. Like if you look at your map and you kind of squint, you see there are a bunch of these little dots going on over here. And then also if you go across over here, we're going to pick up, you see Hawaii is right here, and that's going to be part of it. So what we're going to end up doing is actually going and bracketing and labeling both sides of the map. So if you just want to sort of like pick up and kind of bracket like that, I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect. And then go ahead and bracket again, the other side. And then you just want to label both sides of your map, islands of the Pacific. Okay. In some of these world zones, there will be agrarian civilization. There will be farmers, there will be farming villages, there will eventually even be cities where we have dense networks of political, cultural, and economic exchanges. However, you will see in some of the world zones, there's going to be none of that, or at best, very little. Now, again, this will change once those people that have that technology go to those places during the age of discovery or later with the age of imperialism and kind of bring that technology with them. These areas eventually all will start to come together, but they're not going to have any significant contact, like I said, prior to 1500 or specifically prior to 1492 when Columbus goes and quote unquote discovers the new world. Now, with the origins of agriculture, and I'd like for you to go and start another heading with this and kind of, bold it out because this is going to be something that we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about. The origins of agriculture are going to be something we're going to spend a little bit of time on because you're going to see where agriculture first begins is where we're going to see some of the first civilizations. And then we're going to use geography to explain how those areas of origin, that technology and those people are going to start to expand to other areas outside their immediate area. So the deal here is that farmers interfere with their surroundings far more deliberately, far more purposefully than those that forage or those that hunt and gather. And this, of course, is going to magnify the human impact on the natural environment. And we'll talk about some of those massive changes later on. But also don't forget that it's going to impact the cultures and life ways of the humans themselves. So you're going to see that we're going to be domesticating more than just plants and animals. We're also going to be impacted by it as well. One of the big things here with agriculture, and I'm sure that you will have or you will talk about it in science, is that the farmers, humans in general, have manipulated the plant and animal species so intensively and purposefully that they actually begin to alter the genetic makeup of prey species, like, for example, sheep and goats, which will eventually be some of the first animals farmed, were initially prey species. And we're going to start to alter their genetic code based upon what we find valuable. And you'll see that we'll also do the exact same thing for plants. And you'll see that this is going to be more commonly referred to as domestication or the process of domestication. And you'll see that we'll use that word quite often within this book and the beginning of your textbook here as well. But the big thing here is, and you want to put this next note in all caps and put a bunch of stars by it, because this is going to be what we're really going to start to concentrate on in this portion of the book that we read, and then we'll kind of develop it a little bit later, is the humans did not just domesticate other species. They didn't just domesticate the plants and animals that they found useful, but they also domesticated themselves. You're going to see that they're going to go from being foragers or hunters and gatherers to eventually having agrarian villages, agrarian towns, and agrarian cities, all of which are going to be amazingly complicated and have to change human nature. agriculture, and this is sort of kind of a weird thing to say because you think agriculture, there's a lot of plants, there's a lot of animals, but it doesn't automatically increase biological productivity or biological diversity. In fact, it ends up decreasing in a lot of areas because let's face it, the early farmers are going to farm things that they find valuable. They're not going to continue to farm things that they don't find valuable. I mean, say that you have early farmers who are starting to cultivate wheat. Are they going to continue to grow a crop that tastes like rotten socks or that has a very small yield or is a pain in the butt to grow? Instead, they're going to cultivate, they're going to purposely grow the tastier crops, the hardier crops, the more productive, the more easily grown and harvested crops. So what ultimately ends up is those plants and animals that don't serve any useful function are not going to continue to be planted or are going to be exterminated. Like, for example, wolves and other predators that find lamb chops just as yummy as the rest of us. Early farmers are going to make sure that they get rid of those predators so then they don't harm the livestock. So there's going to be more sheep, but there's going to be less wolves. So you actually get a decrease in biodiversity because of what's going on with farming. But the good news is that agriculture is going to be able to support a larger population. And this is going to be key moving forward because if we have more food, we can support more people. And that is going to be what allows us to grow into the next steps. If we do not have more food, we cannot support more people, and we're not going to be able to develop that sophistication. It's almost like a video game where level one is can you get to agriculture? If you can't first start farming, you're never going to be able to progress to any of the higher levels within that video game. So, where did farming occur first? The best bet is the corridor between the Nile Valley and Mesopotamia. So, what you want to do again is you want to get your map back out and maybe use another color because the area that you want to label, I mean, it's really sort of kind of simple. It's really kind of right there, give or take a little bit, because we're going to pick up here in that circle. We're going to pick up the area right here, which is Mesopotamia, because it says two really, really great rivers of Tigris and Euphrates, and also the Nile Valley. And the Nile Valley is right there. In this talk of where farming first started, and the best bet, like I said before, was between the Nile Valley and Mesopotamia. Any explanation of where this farming occurred must account for the curious fact that after 200,000 years or more, in which all of the humans on Earth that at that point had ever existed had lived as foragers, and that agricultural lifeways appeared just within a few thousand years of each other in parts of the world that had no significant contact with each other. Again, guys, keep in mind that these world zones are pretty much like little bubbles of isolation onto themselves until the age of discovery in the beginning of the 16th century, the late 1400s, earlier 1500s. And the fact that these guys have no significant contact with each other really bashes this very old school idea that farming developed, usually specifically in Mesopotamia, and went from Mesopotamia and just simply expanded worldwide from that single location. And there's a couple other unique things about agriculture of this time. that is going to impact the whole question of where farming first begins. One is that we have foragers who knew about farming, came into contact with farmers. In fact, later on, we'll talk about how they did trading with some of the agriculturalists, but made the conscious choice to stay as foragers rather than becoming farmers. Now, some of that may be the fact, and again, we'll talk a little bit more about this in greater detail later on, but the first couple generations of farmers really had it rough. And the foragers actually, for a little while, have an advantage over the agriculturalists by having better general health and also higher nutritional levels. Within these foragers, there's also another group that become what is known as affluent foragers. These guys are just like really great foragers. They're sort of kind of like, the pro level of forager, where they're able to extract more resources in a given area than any of the traditional foragers are. So just think of these guys as like, pro level foragers. Now, ultimately, some of these foragers, some earlier than others, will be pushed to go into farming. And the argument is that overpopulation may have caused them to shift from that hunting and gathering lifestyle to farming because it would have presented really a kind of a clear choice. Migrate, meaning go and find someplace else where there's good stuff to eat, where they can hunt and they can gather and feed their tummies, or to intensify. Take what they're already doing and just take it to the next level. Eventually, both of these options aren't going to be enough. And in order for them to survive, they're going to have to become farmers. The other unique thing is that some farmers, because farming isn't overly efficient at this point, I mean, it's not necessarily a really good and consistent means of, filling your tum-tums, that some will continue to forage as a safety net. That it's a way for them to go out and get food when crops don't necessarily cut the deal. Again, it's just simply because early farming just simply isn't that efficient or rewarding. It will become so, but early on, not necessarily so. So, what these communities are going to have to do is take some of the already existing skills that they have, which is going to be farming, but it's also going to be hunting and gathering, and intensify those skills in order to increase productivity. One of the things that it's argued that perhaps made agriculture come about when it did is the global warming at the end of the last ice age. This kind of made the intensification of foraging and eventually farming possible because it increases the range and productivity of a lot of the early crops that we're going to see some of the early farmers uh, domesticate and then later consume. There's going to be more areas where these crops are going to be able to grow, and then the crops that are growing because of the warmer conditions, they're just going to be more of them. So it's going to make early agriculture more rewarding than it simply would have been. Some of these arguments really also appear to explain kind of the simultaneous nature of this transition to agriculture at the end of the last ice age. After agriculture had appeared in one region, it spread, primarily because the populations of farming communities grew so fast that they had to find new land to farm. One of the things with agriculture is that okay, it provides more food that can support more people, but those more people are always going to need more food. So you're going to have to find additional ways to feed these more people, and expansion is going to be one of them. Although agriculture may have seemed unattractive for many foragers, farming communities ultimately are going to have more resources and eventually more people. Because again, remember, more food is going to equal more people. And the agriculture that was spread are going to spread into regions that they bordered and that have similar soils, climates, and also ecologies.